I was given a house on my birthday, but my parents took it by force, gave it to my sister, and left me living in my car for months. I thought that was it until my grandpa found me and took action. I'm 22 years old, and I've always been the type of guy who keeps his head down and avoids drama. Not the loudest voice in the room, not the one starting fights or demanding attention, just quiet, respectful, the kind of person who'd rather give in than argue. And that exact personality trait, that's what my family used to absolutely wreck my life. Growing up, I was basically invisible in my own house. The kind of kid who could disappear for hours and nobody would notice or care. I'd come home from school and my parents wouldn't even look up from whatever they were doing. Meanwhile, if my sister walked in the door, it was like the president had arrived. Everyone dropping everything to hear about her day, her problems, her trivial nonsense that somehow always took priority over everything else. I have an older sister, Vanessa, who's 28. For as long as I can remember, she's been the golden child of our family. My parents, James and Linda, both in their early 50s, have treated her like she's the second coming. Everything in our household revolved around Vanessa, her needs, her problems, her wants, her drama. It was always Vanessa, this Vanessa, that we have to help Vanessa. Meanwhile, I was just background noise. The favoritism wasn't even subtle. It was the kind of blatant preferential treatment that would make a sitcom writer say, "Tone it down, nobody will believe this." But it was my reality every single day. I'm talking about stuff that sounds made up, but I swear on everything it's all true. Let me paint you a picture of how bad it was. When Vanessa was in high school, she got a brand new car for her 16th birthday. Not a used Honda or something practical. A new car with the bow on top, whole 9 yards. My parents threw her this huge party, invited everyone we knew, made it this massive celebration. When I turned 16, I got a card with $50 in it and a lecture about responsibility. No party, no celebration. Just another regular day where I was expected to be grateful for the bare minimum. When Vanessa wanted to go to college, my parents paid for everything. Tuition, housing, meal plans, spending money, new laptop, the works. She dropped out after 2 years because she wasn't feeling it and they just shrugged it off like burning 20 grand was no big deal. Told her she'd find her path eventually and not to worry. When I asked about college help, they told me I should look into scholarships or student loans because you're smart enough to figure it out. Translation: we already spent our education budget on your sister and there's nothing left for you. I ended up going to community college part-time while working full-time just to afford it. Took me 5 years to finish my associate degree because I could only take 1 or 2 classes per semester. My parents didn't come to my graduation, said they had other plans that day. Found out later they'd gone to some regional fair with Vanessa to help her look at craft booth rentals for a business idea she never followed through on. The double standards went way beyond education and gifts. Vanessa would borrow my parents' car and bring it back with an empty gas tank and new dents. They'd just laugh it off and fill it back up themselves. I'd borrow the car once for a job interview and brought it back with a quarter tank instead of half and got a 20-minute lecture about respect and responsibility. Different rules for different children based purely on who they liked better. Vanessa married this guy Brandon when she was 22. I never liked him from day one. Something about him just screamed unreliable. Turns out my gut was right because neither of them worked, like at all. Brandon did random odd jobs here and there when he felt like it. Nothing stable or consistent. He'd work at a warehouse for 3 weeks, then quit because his back hurt. Do some rideshare driving for a month, then stop because gas was expensive. Help someone move for $50, then disappear for another month. Just completely unreliable and unmotivated. Vanessa didn't work at all. Her excuse was always that she had to take care of her 2 kids, Sophie, who's 5, and Noah, who's 3. Now look, I get that childcare is expensive and being a stay-at-home parent is legitimate work. But here's the thing, Vanessa wasn't really doing either. She dumped the kids with my mom half the time so she could go shopping or meet friends for lunch. The kids basically raised themselves in front of the TV while she scrolled through social media complaining about how hard her life was. And Brandon. When he wasn't working his occasional jobs, he was playing video games in his underwear or hanging out with his buddies. These two had kids they couldn't afford and just expected everyone else to pick up the slack. Zero planning, zero responsibility, just living in the moment and assuming someone would always bail them out. So how did they survive? Simple. They lived entirely off the monthly money my maternal grandfather George sent them, plus whatever scraps I could contribute when I had a little extra. We're talking about 2 able-bodied adults in their 20s who chose not to work because free money kept rolling in. And my parents enabled every bit of it. My grandfather is 74, been a widower for about 10 years now, and he's a successful retired businessman who lives about 3 hours away in another city. The man built his wealth from nothing, and he's got that old-school work ethic and no tolerance for laziness. Here's the thing about Gramps, he was always my favorite person in the family. And apparently I was his favorite too. Not because I kissed up to him or manipulated him for money, he just always said I was the only one in the family with any sense and actual humility. While my parents and sister saw him as an ATM machine, I actually spent time with him, listened to his stories, learned from him. I worked as an administrative assistant at the small company making about $800 a month. Not exactly rolling in cash, but it was honest work and I was proud of it. The job was boring as hell. Filing paperwork, answering phones, scheduling appointments, basic data entry. Nothing glamorous. But I showed up on time every day, did my work properly, never called in sick unless I was actually dying. That kind of reliability meant something to me, even if nobody else noticed or cared. I paid my own expenses from that $800. Phone bill, car insurance, gas, my share of the grocery money when I still lived at home. Helped out at home when I could, even though technically I was the only one besides my parents actually contributing. And I saved whatever tiny amount was left over, usually between $50 and $100 a month if I was lucky, and nothing unexpected came up. Meanwhile, my parents constantly hounded Gramps for more money for Vanessa and her family. I'd overhear the phone calls. Mom would be on speaker in the kitchen, laying out all of Vanessa's problems like she was reading from a tragedy script. The kids need new shoes. Brandon's car broke down. They're behind on their phone bill. The baby has an ear infection and needs medicine. Always something. Always an emergency. Always more money needed right now. The conversations were always the same guilt-laden manipulation. Vanessa has 2 children to support, they'd remind him constantly. Brandon is looking for work, but it's tough out there. They're trying so hard, but life keeps knocking them down. They just need a little help to get back on their feet. Never mind that they'd been getting back on their feet for 6 solid years and somehow kept falling down again the second that monthly check arrived. And my grandfather would send them $2,500 every single month. Let that sink in. That's more than 3 times what I made busting my tail at work full-time. But it was never enough for them. There was always some emergency, always something the kids urgently needed, always another crisis requiring more money. The goalposts just kept moving further away, no matter how much Gramps sent. 3 months ago was my 22nd birthday. I wasn't expecting anything special because celebrations weren't really a thing for me and my family. My birthday usually passed with maybe a card, and if I was really lucky, someone would remember to say happy birthday at dinner. That was the extent of it. Meanwhile, Vanessa's birthday every year was this massive production with cakes and decorations and gifts piled high. But that day I got a call from Gramps and his voice sounded excited. He said he was on his way and had a surprise for me. My heart started racing because Gramps never drove 3 hours unless it was something important. He drove from his city 2 hours, and when he arrived, the whole family was gathered in the cramped 2-bedroom apartment where we all lived. Yeah, you read that right. 7 people in a 2-bedroom apartment. Me, my parents, Vanessa, Brandon, and their 2 kids. It was absolute chaos every single day. My parents had the master bedroom. Vanessa and Brandon took the 2nd bedroom. The 2 kids slept on a pull-out couch in the living room. And me, I had an air mattress in the corner of the living room that I'd blow up at night and deflate every morning. No privacy whatsoever. Couldn't even have a private phone conversation without someone listening in or asking who I was talking to. The bathroom situation was a nightmare with 7 people sharing one shower. I'd have to wake up at 5 a.m. just to guarantee I could shower before everyone else used up the hot water. The kitchen was too small for everyone to eat together, so we'd rotate shifts like some kind of prison cafeteria. And the noise. Constant, never-ending noise. Kids screaming and crying, TV blaring cartoons all day, Brandon and Vanessa arguing about something, Mom on the phone complaining to her friends about her hard life, never a moment of peace or quiet, just miserable. I'd been saving up to move out, but every time I got close to having enough for a security deposit, something would happen and I'd feel obligated to help out with money. Looking back, I'm pretty sure they timed their emergencies to coincide with whenever I had a decent amount saved. Gramps walked in with this huge smile and a large envelope in his hands. He hugged me tight and told everyone to sit down. We crammed into the tiny living room and he handed me the envelope. My hands were literally shaking as I took it from him. Whatever was inside, I knew it was important by the way he was looking at me. Inside were keys and a stack of legal documents. Real official-looking papers with county seals and notary stamps. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold them steady enough to read. My grandfather's eyes were actually watering when he told me it was a house. A beautiful 3-bedroom house in the Meadowbrook neighborhood, fully furnished and modern, completely ready to move in. And it was in my name. Mine. legally mine. He explained that he'd been planning this for over a year, had been looking at properties, talking to real estate agents, making sure he found the perfect place. He said he wanted to give me a real start in life, something solid to build on, that I'd proven myself through hard work and sacrifice, and never asking for handouts. This was his way of recognizing that and giving me the foundation I deserved. I literally couldn't speak. My brain just stopped working. Like when you try to process information that's too good to be true and your mind just goes blank. I tried to say I couldn't accept something that huge, but he cut me off. Took my hands in his weathered old hands and looked me straight in the eyes. Told me I deserved it more than anyone he knew. He said I was a good person, truly good, respectful, and hardworking, even when nobody appreciated it, that I never asked him for anything or caused problems. Never once had I called him begging for money or making up emergencies. I just quietly worked hard and helped others without expecting anything back. The house was his way of showing me he saw all of that, and was proud of me that everything I'd done mattered even if my parents didn't seem to notice. I completely broke down crying right there in the living room. Not dignified manly tears either, full-on sobbing like a kid who just got told Santa was real after all. Hugged him so tight I probably cracked one of his ribs. It was the most incredible thing anyone had ever done for me. After 22 years of being the afterthought, the background character in my own family, someone had finally seen me and valued me. When I looked at my family through my tears, I should have paid more attention to their reactions. My parents had these weird, unreadable expressions on their faces. Not happy for me, not proud, just a strange, calculating look. Vanessa looked straight up, annoyed and jealous. Her face had that pinched expression she always got when attention wasn't on her. Brandon was frowning, probably already running calculations in his head, but I was too overwhelmed with gratitude and emotion to care about any of that or think about what it might mean. The next day, Gramps took me to see the house before he drove back home. It was absolutely perfect. 3 real bedrooms with actual closet space, 2 full bathrooms, a modern kitchen with appliances that actually worked, spacious living room, proper dining area, even a small garden in the back. Everything was furnished with good taste. Not fancy, expensive stuff, but quality furniture that made it feel like a real home. Gramps hugged me one more time before he left. Told me to take care of it and enjoy it because I deserved it. I drove back to the apartment, literally floating on cloud 9. For the first time in my entire life, I had something that was truly mine. My own space, a real future opening up in front of me. But that feeling lasted exactly as long as it took me to walk through the apartment door. My mom was waiting in the living room with a serious expression. Dad was next to her. Vanessa and Brandon were there too, all of them just sitting there like some kind of intervention setup. Mom said we needed to talk, and I said sure, still smiling like an idiot because I was so happy about the house. That's when Dad dropped the bomb. He said they'd been thinking, and the house was too big for me. My smile died right there. I asked what he meant, and Mom jumped in saying I lived alone. No partner, no kids. So what did I need 3 bedrooms for? I tried to say maybe in the future I'd need the space. Maybe I'd want a home office or a guest room or just space to breathe. But Dad cut me off. He said Vanessa had 2 children and Sophie and Noah needed space to grow and play, that they were cramped in the apartment, and it wasn't fair for me to have that whole house to myself while her kids suffered in these conditions. Vanessa chimed in with this whiny, manipulative voice saying her children deserved better than the tiny apartment, that I was being selfish, keeping all that space when they clearly needed it more. I said Gramps gave the house to me, and it was mine. Mom hit me with that classic line about how family shares and family supports each other. Like suddenly we were this tight-knit, loving family when it was convenient for them. I pointed out that I'd been supporting them financially whenever I could, giving them money from my tiny paycheck when they had emergencies. But Dad said this was different. This was about giving my niece and nephew a chance to grow up happy and healthy. Then he actually looked me in the eyes and asked if I didn't want them to be happy, like he was trying to guilt-trip me into feeling like some kind of monster who wanted children to suffer. It was manipulative as hell, and looking back, I can't believe I fell for it. But in the moment, with all 3 of them staring at me, making me feel like the bad guy, it worked. That was just the beginning. For the next 3 weeks, it was constant pressure from every single angle. Every day started with some comment about the house. Every conversation somehow circled back to how I was being unreasonable. Every meal together included pointed remarks about my selfishness. It was psychological warfare, and I was the target. Mom would start in at breakfast. While I was trying to eat my cereal before work, she'd make these comments about how some people care more about possessions than family, how some people forget where they came from the second they get something nice. Just constant needling designed to make me feel guilty for having something good. Dad would ambush me when I got home from work. I'd barely walk through the door and he'd corner me with more arguments, talking about family values and how his father would be disappointed to see me acting this way. Ironic since Gramps specifically gave me the house and not them. But logic didn't matter in these conversations. Vanessa was the worst, though. She'd cry these fake tears and talk about how Sophie asked her why they couldn't have a nice house like Uncle Tyler, how Noah didn't understand why they had to sleep in the living room. She'd show me pictures of the kids looking sad like that somehow proved they were suffering from my choices. The kids were fine. They were happy playing with their toys. But Vanessa would frame everything like they were living in some kind of Dickensian nightmare. Brandon mostly stayed quiet but would occasionally add his 2 cents. Usually something about how a real man would put family first or how he'd give up anything for his kids. Rich coming from a guy who barely worked and lived off handouts. But he'd say it with this knowing smirk like he had me all figured out. It was constant, exhausting, overwhelming. They'd gang up on me 3-on-1, sometimes 4, when Brandon bothered to join in. I'd try to escape to my corner with the air mattress, but there was nowhere to go in that tiny apartment. Nowhere to get away from the constant pressure and guilt trips and manipulation. They'd bring it up at random times. I'd be watching TV and someone would make a comment. I'd be doing dishes and Dad would start another lecture. I'd be trying to fall asleep and hear them in the next room talking loudly about how selfish some people were. They wanted me to hear it, wanted me to know they were talking about me. It was calculated psychological pressure. After 3 solid weeks of this relentless campaign, I finally broke. I was exhausted, mentally drained, couldn't think straight anymore from the constant barrage. Every defense I tried to put up, they'd knock down with more guilt and more pressure. I felt like I was drowning, and they just kept pushing my head underwater. I told them fine, Vanessa could have the house. The celebrations were immediate. Vanessa actually hugged me for the first time in years. My parents patted my back saying I was such a good brother. Brandon smiled at me, probably already planning how to mooch off the new free house. That same week, they had me sign some papers. They told me it was just a formality, temporary paperwork, so Vanessa and her family could move in. I was so mentally drained and beaten down that I signed without really reading everything. Big mistake. Huge. Within 3 days, they had completely moved into my house. My house. The one Gramps gave me. I helped them move their stuff in because of course I did. I was still in that doormat mindset. When the last box was inside, Vanessa turned to me and said they needed time to settle in as a family alone. She said I should give them space for a few days. I drove back to the apartment figuring I'd stay there temporarily while they got settled. But when I walked in, my parents had this weird energy. Dad told me to sit down. He said since the apartment was originally rented for the family, and now Vanessa wasn't living there anymore, they couldn't afford to keep paying for it. They were moving to a smaller place, just the 2 of them. I asked where I was supposed to live. Mom said I'd figure something out, that I was resourceful and young, that this was my chance to be independent. I asked about going back to the house, and Dad said that wouldn't work. Vanessa's family needed stability, and having me there would be disruptive. Brandon apparently felt uncomfortable with me around. Vanessa said the kids needed their space. That's when I realized what had actually happened. They hadn't just convinced me to let Vanessa borrow the house. They'd completely taken it from me. And now they were kicking me out of the apartment too. For the next 2 weeks, I bounced between a friend's couch and my car. My friend Chris tried to help, but his place was a studio apartment barely big enough for him. I'd crash on his couch for 2 or 3 nights until I felt like I was overstaying my welcome. Then, I'd make some excuse about staying somewhere else and end up back in my car. Most nights, I ended up sleeping in my beat-up old car parked in random spots around town. I'd try to find quiet residential streets where cops wouldn't bother me. Sometimes I'd park in 24-hour store parking lots. Once I even slept in the parking garage of my office building after everyone left. Anywhere I could find that felt somewhat safe. The car became my entire world. I kept a gym bag with clean work clothes, had a cooler for cheap food I'd buy from gas stations, kept my important documents in a locked box under the passenger seat. Tried to make it work, but it was degrading and exhausting. You don't realize how much you need a home base until you don't have one. I kept working at my job, but it was rough, really rough. My boss started noticing I looked tired all the time. I'd make excuses about not sleeping well or having allergies. Couldn't exactly admit I was living in my car because my family stole my house. That's not the kind of thing you admit at work without people looking at you differently. Showering became this whole ordeal. I'd go to a 24-hour gym when I could afford the day pass, which was $10 I really couldn't spare. Other days, I'd do the best I could with gas station bathrooms and wet wipes, real glamorous. Nothing makes you feel lower than brushing your teeth over a gas station sink while truckers give you weird looks. Eating was another nightmare. No fridge meant I couldn't keep real food. I lived off protein bars. Packaged snacks, whatever, didn't need refrigeration. Lost about 15 pounds those first few weeks because I was too stressed to eat properly and couldn't afford much anyway. People at work asked if I was sick. I'd lie and say I was trying this new diet. The worst was trying to maintain any appearance of normalcy. Going to work every day pretending everything was fine. Smiling when coworkers asked how my weekend was. Making up stories about my day instead of admitting I'd spent the previous night folded up in my car trying to sleep while some guy had a loud phone argument in the parking lot next to me. I drove past the house sometimes. My house, the house that was supposed to be mine. Couldn't help myself, even though it hurt every single time. I'd see lights on inside Brandon's car in the driveway, toys scattered in the yard, Sophie and Noah playing in the garden that should have been mine, living the life that should have been mine, and I'd be sitting in my car with a stiff back and a growling stomach wondering how I let this happen. The worst part was my family had completely ghosted me. Not one phone call to check if I was okay, no texts asking where I was staying or if I needed anything, nothing. Complete radio silence. They got what they wanted and I was disposable useless now that they'd taken everything I had. 5 months of this. 5 long, miserable months sleeping in my car, showering at public facilities, eating garbage food to save whatever money I could. 5 months of feeling like the biggest idiot on the planet for letting them do this to me. 5 months of shame and regret, and wondering if things would ever get better. Then one morning, everything changed. I'd gotten tired of moving around every night, so I started parking on the street right in front of the house. Call it pathetic, but some part of me wanted them to see me there, to feel some kind of guilt. Not that it worked. They'd see my car and just go about their day like I didn't exist. I was asleep in the driver's seat, uncomfortable as always, when I heard loud knocking on the window. Scared me half to death. I jumped up and looked out to see my grandfather's face staring back at me. His expression went from concerned to confused to absolutely furious in about 2 seconds. He yanked open my car door and asked what I was doing sleeping there. I stammered something, but before I could explain, he looked at the house and then back at me. Asked what happened to the house he gave me. Didn't I like it? Why was I sleeping in my car instead of inside? That's when my mom came rushing out of the house. No idea how she was even there, but apparently she'd been visiting. She saw Gramps and put on this fake surprised voice asking what he was doing there and that they didn't know he was coming. Gramps completely ignored her, just kept staring at me waiting for an answer. I tried to explain, but my voice cracked. He asked louder what happened to the house. Mom nervously approached and said she could explain. Gramps turned to her with this dangerous tone and told her to explain why his grandson was sleeping in a car in front of the house he'd given him. Mom actually swallowed hard before saying they took it from me and gave it to Vanessa. The silence after that was deafening. Gramps just whispered like he couldn't believe what he'd heard. Mom kept rambling, trying to justify it. Said Vanessa had a family, had a husband, and kids deserved it more. That I was young and alone without a partner. What did I need such a big house for when I was just a failure who hadn't even started a family? Vanessa needed it more. I watched my grandfather's face go through about 5 different emotions. Disbelief, shock, rage, disgust, and finally pure fury. Without saying another word, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Mom asked nervously what he was doing. He spoke into the phone asking for a patrol car at this address immediately, said there were people illegally occupying a property that was in his name and his grandson's name. Mom lost it, started screaming that he couldn't do this, that children lived there. Gramps yelled back louder than I'd ever heard him, that children shouldn't be living in a stolen house. He walked straight toward the front door, and Mom tried to block him, but he just pushed past her. He went inside shouting for everyone to get out right now. The screaming from inside was insane. Vanessa shrieking, Brandon stammering excuses, Dad trying to calm everything down. The kids crying because everyone was yelling. Gramps kept shouting that the house belonged to me, that he paid for it with his money and gave it to me, and absolutely nobody had the right to take it. Vanessa came out crying, saying her children needed this house. Gramps that her children needed parents who actually worked, not a stolen house. Dad came out trying to smooth things over, calling it a misunderstanding. Gramps turned on him with blazing eyes and asked how leaving his own son to sleep in a car on the street was a misunderstanding. Vanessa tried saying I agreed to give them the house. Gramps asked if they pressured me, manipulated me, took advantage of my nature. Nobody answered because the guilt was written all over their faces. 10 minutes later, 2 police cars showed up. Gramps showed the officers the original property deeds with both our names clearly listed as owners. The cops reviewed everything, talked to my family, and finally told Vanessa and Brandon they had to vacate the property. Gave them 1 hour to grab their essential belongings. Mom started crying, saying they had nowhere to go. The officer, this older guy who looked like he'd seen everything, said firmly that wasn't the law's problem and told them to start packing. His partner, a younger woman, started taking notes and photos of the scene for their report. The next hour was complete chaos. Was complete. Vanessa was sobbing dramatically while throwing clothes into suitcases, making sure everyone could hear how unfair this all was, how cruel, how she didn't deserve this. Brandon was muttering curses under his breath while hauling boxes and bags, kept shooting me these dirty looks like somehow I was the villain in this situation. My parents were begging Gramps to reconsider, trying every manipulation tactic they'd perfected over the years. Dad tried the sympathy angle, talking about how they were getting older and couldn't handle this stress, how this would hurt their health. Gramps just stared at him with zero sympathy. Mom tried guilt, reminded him of all the years they'd cared for him when his wife died, how they'd been there for him. Gramps pointed out he'd repaid that support 100 times over with the money he'd given them for Vanessa. The kids were confused and crying. Sophie kept asking her mom why they had to leave. Noah was clinging to Vanessa, terrified by all the yelling and tension. Part of me felt bad for them because none of this was their fault. They were just innocent kids caught in the middle of their parents' greed and lies. But the bigger part of me knew this was necessary. They needed to learn young that actions have consequences. Gramps stood firm next to me in the yard with his arm around my shoulders the entire time. A united front. Every time my parents approached him with another plea or excuse, he'd just shake his head and tell them their time was running out. His presence gave me strength, made me feel like maybe I wasn't the weak, pathetic person I'd felt like for 5 months. Neighbors had come out to watch the spectacle, standing on their porches or peeking through windows. Small-town gossip travels fast, premium drama. I should have been embarrassed, but honestly I was past caring. Let everyone see what my family really was. Let them know the truth. Vanessa tried one last play when there were only 10 minutes left. She approached me directly, bypassing Gramps with tears running down her face. Begged me to tell the police it was all a misunderstanding. Said she'd give the house back. We could work something out. But her eyes told a different story. She was just trying to buy time, figure out another angle. If I called off the cops, she'd find a way to stay, and I'd be back to square one. I looked her right in the eyes and told her no. Simple as that. No explanation. No justification. Just no. The look on her face was priceless. She'd never heard me stand up to her before, never seen me refuse anything. She actually stumbled back like I'd slapped her. Exactly 1 hour later, my family was on the sidewalk with their suitcases and bags piled around them. Vanessa was hysterical, makeup running down her face. My parents looked completely defeated, older somehow than they had an hour ago. Brandon was pacing back and forth, probably trying to figure out which friend's couch they could crash on. The kids were still crying, overwhelmed by everything happening. The police officers did one final check of the house to make sure they'd removed all essential items. Told them they could arrange a time to get the rest later, but for now they needed to leave the property. One officer gave me his card and told me to call if my family tried to come back without permission. Suggested I might want to change the locks as possible. Mom tried pleading one more time, asking him not to cut off the monthly support because the children needed to eat. Gramps looked at her with this expression of pure disappointment. Said from that day forward, they wouldn't receive a single cent more from him. The monthly money was over. The help was over. Everything was over. Vanessa cried about the children, and he said coldly that the children were their parents' responsibility. He pointed at Vanessa and Brandon and told them to get jobs and work like I'd worked my entire life. Told them to humble themselves like they'd humbled me. Dad tried one more time, but Gramps cut him off. Told my parents they were a disgrace for favoring one child so much they destroyed the other. For allowing them to steal their own son's house and leave him on the street. Said they didn't deserve to be called parents. Mom desperately said they were family. Gramps hugged me tighter and said I was his family. That they were just toxic people who happened to share his blood. Told them he never wanted to see them again. Not to come near the house or near me or contact him. It was over. He left them there on the sidewalk with their stuff and their shame. We went into the house together, my house finally actually mine. I started apologizing through tears, saying I was weak and should have stood up for myself. He said I wasn't weak, I was kind, and they abused that kindness. But it was over now, and he'd make sure nobody ever took it from me again. The following weeks were an adjustment period. I properly moved into the house, slept in a real bed for the first time in 5 months, showered in an actual bathroom with hot water and privacy, cooked in a kitchen with a full fridge and working appliances. It felt completely surreal. My family tried contacting me constantly. Phone calls, texts, emails, messages about how the children were hungry, how they couldn't afford rent, how Vanessa was suffering. 3 weeks after getting evicted, Mom sent me this long message, said, "They made a terrible mistake, but we were family, and I couldn't just leave them like this," begged me to help them. For the first time in my life, I responded firmly. Told her no, that for years I'd helped them, given them my money and my understanding, and when I finally had something truly my own, they took it without remorse and left me on the street. Told them to get jobs like I always had. Then I blocked all their numbers. Gramps visited a week later to check on me. We had coffee in my living room, and he asked how I felt. I told him honestly that I felt free for the first time in my life. He smiled with tears in his eyes and said that's exactly what he wanted to hear. The best part. About a month ago, I heard through a mutual family friend that Vanessa and Brandon both had to get actual jobs. Brandon works at a warehouse now doing manual labor, and Vanessa is waiting tables. My parents downsized to a tiny studio apartment. They're all struggling and learning what actual work feels like. Do I feel bad about it? Not even a little bit. They made their choices. They treated me like garbage, manipulated my kind nature, stole from me, and left me homeless. Now they're dealing with the consequences of their actions. That's not me being cruel, that's just reality catching up to them. The papers I signed, turns out they'd basically forged documents claiming I was willingly transferring ownership. When Gramps showed the cops the real original deeds with both our names, it proved the whole thing was bogus. My family could have actually been charged with fraud, but Gramps decided the public humiliation and financial consequences were punishment enough. I agreed with him on that one. I changed my phone number and only gave the new one to Gramps and my actual friends. Nobody in my immediate family has any way to contact me now. Sometimes I wonder if they drive by the house hoping to see me outside so they can try to guilt trip me again. But honestly, I don't even care anymore. They're dead to me.